Welcome to Dark Corner's Top 10 Ray Harryhausen Creatures. In our retrospective, Mythmaker, the fantasy films of Ray Harryhausen, we asked for your favourite Harryhausen creatures, and with those results, plus a bit of favouritism, we've compiled a thematic top 10 creatures from cinema's special effects titan. In 1995, Ray Harryhausen gave a lecture to an audience of paleontologists on how dinosaurs might have moved, a question on which he had a unique perspective. Harryhausen made only 3 films featuring dinosaurs, 4 if you count the fictional Redosaurus in The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. Yet they were a key part of his career. His first exposure to stop-motion animation at the age of 5 was The Lost World, and dinosaurs also featured in King Kong, the film that inspired him. Most of his early test films centred on dinosaurs, and they are a common theme in his unproduced movies, from Valley of the Mist in 1950 to People of the Mist in 1982, as well as King of the Genies, in which Sinbad would have faced dinosaurs. Of the films he actually made, neither Animal World, a pseudo-documentary made for producer Irwin Allen, nor 1 Million Years BC were strictly Harryhausen films. He was an animator for hire, though the dinosaur scenes in the latter are tremendous, and certainly an improvement on the 1940 original. That said, the first dinosaur in the remake is an iguana, included to convince audiences that everything they saw was real. This was the animator's own suggestion, and one he later regretted. But for a real Harryhausen dinosaur film, you've got to go with The Valley of Gwangi. A dinosaur western and a childhood favourite for many, the title character is our pick for the number 10 spot. Gwangi is a cross between a Tyrannosaurus rex and an Allosaurus, which Harryhausen said allowed flexibility between aggressiveness and agility, and his first entrance would later be referenced by Steven Spielberg in Jurassic Park. To get a consistent eyeline from actors, Harryhausen used a 15-foot pole with eyes on top called a monster stick. For the roping scene, the stick was mounted on the back of a jeep so the cowboys had something to rope. Because the jeep was too big to be hidden by the model, the live action to the left and right of the screen had to be shot separately, then combined in the lab via a split-screen process. Incidentally, one of the models of Gwangi became a favourite toy of Harryhausen's 5-year-old daughter Vanessa, who took it to bed like a teddy bear. Harryhausen is far less associated with aliens than dinosaurs, and yet they too were the subjects of 3 films, numerous tests and unrealised projects. This wonderful piece of concept art comes from The Jupiterian, an experimental film Harryhausen shot in 1937. One of the great regrets of the animator's career was that he was unable to make H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds, for which he executed many drawings, and this test footage. And here is test footage of Harryhausen himself fighting off one of the elementals. Another unrealised project about bat-winged aliens that attack Paris. Despite some incredible concept art, the aliens in Earth vs. the Flying Saucers ended up as men in suits, as did most of the insectoid selenites in First Men in the Moon, though the higher status ones were animated.
Tell us of its life, how it differs from ours.
As were the giant moon calves. But there's really only one creature who can take this slot. Though the plot of 20 Million Miles to Earth is standard enough, the Emir is far more than a monster on the rampage. Featuring all the lively and sympathetic characterisation that we associate with Harryhausen's later fantasies. The Emir changed a lot in development. It had originally been a Cyclops, and the model's armature, its articulated metal skeleton, was reused for Sinbad's Cyclops. The armature was made by Harryhausen's father, Fred Harryhausen, who made the armatures for all his son's creatures until his death shortly after First Men in the Moon. While the Emir is undoubtedly the star of 20 Million Miles to Earth, perhaps the most challenging piece of animation was his fight with an elephant. Because while audiences had no idea how an alien might move, they were familiar with elephants. The real elephant proved smaller than Harryhausen had anticipated, so a 4'6" actor was hired to play the keeper to make it look bigger. Harryhausen was diligent in his research. For Clash of the Titans, he studied scorpions. For Sinbad and the Eye of the Tiger, he watched both tigers and domestic cats, combining the mannerisms of both. But drama came first. The giant crab in Mysterious Island was a real crab's shell, from Harrods no less, with an armature inside. But it does not move sideways as real crabs do, because forwards and back made a better confrontation. Giant animals are a common feature of Harryhausen films, whether in Gulliver's alligator or Mysterious Island's nautiloid cephalopod. And H.G. Wells' Food of the Gods was another unrealised project. But our number 8 pick is Cassim from Sinbad and the Eye of the Tiger, an Arabian prince who has been turned into a baboon.
The beast was playing me.
Yes, I know. He has beaten me twice.
Unlike most Harryhausen creations, Cassim appears throughout the film, a character on a par with the actors. To achieve the necessary detail, Harryhausen's model included tiny levers in the face, allowing the baboon a range of expressions. He also has a character journey, gradually losing his humanity. The chess games are wonderful examples of a model interacting with the real world, but they also illustrate Cassim becoming more animal, getting angry when he loses. Just like a real baboon. It's likely that Harryhausen animated more humans than anything else, because every time a creature picked someone up, the animator took over. But there are also a number of humanoid creations in the Harryhausen bestiary, right from his first feature. Mighty Joe Young peeling a banana at the end of the film was a touch added by Harryhausen to show that he had gone Hollywood, and the gesture is repeated almost 3 decades later by Cassim, demonstrating his underlying humanity. Calibos in Clash of the Titans is a unique Harryhausen character. Originally to have been wholly animated, it became necessary to give him dialogue, and so actor Neil McCarthy, aided by Colin Arthur's makeup, played him in close-up, while the long shots showing his tail and goat leg were animated. This shot is more complicated than it looks, because the live action was shot with a moving camera, meaning that Harryhausen had to raise the animation table at the same rate as the camera move. In his features, pressures of time and budget meant that the camera was almost always static, but in his fairy tales, you can see how Harryhausen created cinematic camera work, one frame at a time. The most loved of Harryhausen's humanoids is Trog, the friendly Neanderthal whose death in Sinbad and the Eye of the Tiger is the cause of a good deal of childhood trauma. Though he is not as showy as the Hydra or Kali, Harryhausen was extremely proud of what he called Trog's animated passivity. The small, subtle movements that tell you this is a living, thinking creature, even when he is not doing anything specific, were far harder for the animator to achieve than anything in the later fight scene. While fights between human and model had to be carefully choreographed, fights between models gave Harryhausen free rein to improvise, one move leading to the next, giving these sequences the energy and unpredictability of a real fight. Winged creatures always gave the animator a headache, as they required the use of an aerial brace, making for more time-consuming animation. And yet, all the fantasy films feature at least one flying creature, from Sinbad's giant roc to Clash of the Titans' giant vulture. Before he was Doctor Who, Patrick Troughton fended off aerial attack from the Harpies in Jason and the Argonauts. And after he was Doctor Who, he fended off aerial attack from a giant wasp in Sinbad and the Eye of the Tiger. The most human of these creatures is the homunculus in The Golden Voyage of Sinbad, seen here with "It's Doctor Who again!" Sidebar, it was reportedly in this film that Tom Baker caught the eye of Doctor Who producer Barry Letts. But of all the flying creatures, the one that most captures the imagination is Pegasus in Clash of the Titans. He could almost have fitted into our real animals category, the animator accurately recreating the behaviour of a horse, even in flight. Though the roping scene was executed by Harryhausen himself, much of the aerial work was done by Jim Danforth under Harryhausen's supervision, and it presented a problem. What does a horse do with its legs when it flies? Tests showed that tucking the legs beneath him looked unnatural, while leaving them hanging there made him look dead. And it's now impossible to imagine these scenes any other way but with Pegasus galloping through the air with that unbridled vitality that makes him such a memorable creation. Harryhausen films take a mix and match approach to the creatures. In The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, the Cyclops is from Greek myth, the dragon from European, the roc from Arabian, and the snake woman from South Asian. Harryhausen's choice of creature was driven more by his own interests and the requirements of the story than by cultural authenticity. Likewise, the creature's appearance was dictated more by what was cinematic than by tradition. The Kraken, a Norse legend cameoing in a Greek myth, is usually depicted as a giant squid or octopus. But Harryhausen wanted something more humanoid that could look the sacrificial Andromeda in the face, mirroring a similar scene in King Kong. But in a crowded field, we've gone with one of the most complex single creatures Harryhausen ever realised. It says something about the way that Jason and the Argonauts has penetrated the popular consciousness that most people now think it was a hydra guarding the Golden Fleece in the original myth. In fact, it was a dragon, or serpent, depending on which version you read, but having already animated a dragon, Harryhausen borrowed the hydra from the labours of Hercules, creating a labour for himself. The animator seldom took notes as he worked, finding it disrupted the flow, and the hydra was one of his most mentally taxing sequences. Each frame of film could require over 30 individual movements, that's 720 per second, with the animator having to remember which head was going which way. He would say later that any sudden jerks in the movement probably indicate where he went to lunch.
Remember now, it's 3 against 1.
Medusa does of course belong in the previous category as the key figure in the story of Perseus, but she deserves her own spot. Again, Harryhausen played fast and loose with legend, giving the mythical Gorgon a snake's body and scaly skin. Since watching King Kong wrestle a serpentine creature, Harryhausen had a fascination with animating snakes. It was somewhat curtailed by his longtime producer Charles Schneer, who detested snakes, and so we missed out on the Valley of Vipers in The Golden Voyage of Sinbad, and the Cyclops giant snake fight in The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad. Medusa represents the apex of Harryhausen's obsession. As well as her body, she has 12 snakes in her hair. Again, diverging from myth, they are on her head rather than growing from it. And because their heads and tails were separate, these alone required 24 movements per frame. And for good measure, she has another twisted about her arm. Credit should also be given to Janet Moore, who sculpted Medusa and other models for Clash of the Titans and Sinbad and the Eye of the Tiger, based on Harryhausen's sketches. In his autobiography, An Animated Life, Harryhausen called the Medusa sequence the the one he was most proud of, and rightly so. It's not just a remarkable piece of animation, but a great piece of filmmaking. There are so many unrealised Harryhausen projects, they could fill a book. This one, for instance, by the Ray and Diana Harryhausen Foundation's John Walsh. The most atypical project in it is Skin and Bones, based on the comic novel by Thorne Smith about a man who becomes invisible except for his skeleton. Clearly, skeletons were a favourite subject of the animator, as they are the only ones of his models to be used in more than one film, with just a new paint job. Actor Kerwin Matthews had to shadow fight his way through this scene in The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, and fight choreographer Enzo Musumeci Greco made this easier by setting the fight to an 8-beat rhythm, clapped out by his assistant, which may also be why Bernard Herrmann's score works so well. Jason and his Argonauts were originally to have fought rotting corpses, but skeletons were more censor-friendly, and the result is the animator's single most iconic scene. This time the choreographer was Fernando Poggi, and again it was rehearsed with stuntmen in advance. During animation, Harryhausen had to count the number of frames until the swords clashed, so he knew how far to move the sword with each frame. But he was doing this for 3 live action fighters and 7 animated. While his animation was always simple and economical, the scene showcases how Harryhausen always put cinematic drama first. The skeletons push their way up out of the earth, a difficult and time-consuming effect. In his autobiography, Harryhausen observed, "I could have made the skeletons simply appear in a cloud of smoke, but the result would not have been the same." Bringing inanimate objects to life was how stop motion began in the early days of cinema, with animated matches and toys. And Harryhausen tackled non-living creations on several occasions.
Shh, listen.
Earth vs. the Flying Saucers is an oft-overlooked Harryhausen film because it lacks creatures, but the animator treated it with the same dedication. The rim and centre of the saucers remain static, while the inner circle turns, making them more interesting to look at. And for the ultimate in animating the inanimate, bear in mind that the destruction of the Washington Monument and the Capitol Dome were also animated, each piece of rubble suspended from wires, progressing frame by frame. This inanimation also features in several of the fantasy films. There are engineered creations like Bubo in Clash of the Titans, largely animated by Steve Archer, or the Minotaur in Sinbad and the Eye of the Tiger, played in the long shots by Peter Mayhew. Incidentally, according to special effects makeup artist Colin Arthur, it was his appearance in Eye of the Tiger that got Mayhew the role of Chewbacca in Star Wars. 2 metallic inanimates were top scorers in our poll, and while many of you chose the super complex Carly, far more went for Talos. While Carly is a fantastic piece of animation, Talos is a great piece of cinema. His unnerving introduction, one of the great entrances. To sell the idea of the metal statue moving, Harryhausen gave Talos deliberately stiff and stilted movements, going against the natural instincts of an animator who had spent a career striving for smoothness. Accompanied by Bernard Herrmann's thunderous score, Talos is an iconic scene, not just in Harryhausen's back catalogue, but in film history. Hundreds of you commented and continue to comment on our documentary Mythmaker, telling us your favourite creatures. And one thing that was clear was that they were choices made with the heart, which was all the justification I needed to reserve this slot for my personal favourite. The Cyclops was certainly the most important Harryhausen creation. It was proof of concept in the film that made all the later ones possible. It was originally to have been more humanoid, but Harryhausen added the goat legs after remembering what Willis O'Brien had told him about people thinking that Kong was a man in a suit. The shot of him licking his lips while roasting a sailor was cut in the UK, as was the skeleton sequence, because it would be too frightening for young children. But, like so much of Harryhausen's work, what it really does is to make the Cyclops real, a character with the capacity to anticipate a nice meal. And it works. The film draws on the legend of Odysseus as the Cyclops is blinded, and his uncertain movements, feeling his way, is another stellar piece of character animation, leading to... Even though he was trying to eat poor Harufa, for me, that is the saddest moment in the film.
He's dead!
And that is the thing about Harryhausen creatures. Of course, we admire the imagination and the skill. We enjoy the exciting fights and iconic moments. But when it comes right down to it, we love them. And, based on our survey, they are all number one to someone. Thanks for watching, and as always, thanks to our Patreon supporters who make videos like this possible. Ray Harryhausen always encouraged young animators, so outside of Harryhausen and O'Brien, what stop-motion animation do you admire? Share the love in the comments below.